Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday video. Today, we are diving deep into the past, into the ancient world, and we're going to be looking at the First Punic War. Well, let's just say information for that is a little bit scarcer than how to build a ship of the line of the 18th century. So why not get someone who spent a lot more time than I have studying this? So special guest who is that way. No, that way. Hey, that way. Would you like to please introduce yourself and let everyone know who you are?
Hi, I'm Bret Deveraux, an ancient military historian. I have my PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. I'm currently a teaching assistant professor at um, NC State. I also write a history, military history, and pop culture blog, a collection of unmitigated pedantry.
Which is definitely worth checking out. Um, so, with the introductions done, as per usual, we're going to be asking questions on my side and listening to the answers on the other side. So, I guess the first question, a bit of background: what exactly is going on between Rome and Carthage in the run up to the First Punic War?
Yeah, so these are not states meeting for the first time. Obviously, to sort of situate ourselves geographically, right? Rome, I hope we all know where Rome is in the middle of the Italian peninsula. Rome has by the beginning of the First Punic War in 264 is largely dominated what the Romans understand as Italy, which they mean peninsular Italy, um, not including the Po River Valley, so really peninsular Italy. Um, Carthage, of course, is a North African polity, in what today would be Tunis. And Carthage has a sort of strong hegemony in that region and then looser control over a range of settlements across North Africa, Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, and maybe little footholds in Spain at this point, though the big Spanish Carthaginian Empire will happen after this war. That's built by the Barcids. Um, Rome and Carthage interact with each other pretty early. The first treaty we know about between them is in 509, which, the historically minded may realize that's the very first year of the Roman Republic. The fact that the Romans kick out the kings and immediately conclude a treaty with Carthage suggests that they probably had some interactions before they kicked out the kings, and it was necessary to renew that treaty. That treaty is really limited. It essentially just recognizes spheres of influence. The Carthaginians agree not to muck about in Italy, and the Romans agree not to muck about in Carthaginian territory in North Africa or Sicily. There are a few other treaties through the 300s, but most recently, as we get into the early 200s, Rome and Carthage had actually been allies in their fighting against Pyrrhus of Epirus. This is a Greek-speaking military adventurer who had intervened in Italy to defend Tarentum, one of the last independent Italian communities, a Greek-speaking community, from the Romans. Famously fought a bunch of battles with the Romans that he won but wasn't able to capitalize on because of his heavy losses. Midway through, he gets bored and wanders off to Sicily to rumble with the Carthaginians, fighting on the side of Syracuse, alongside Agathocles, then the tyrant of Syracuse, another Greek community in Sicily. And so the Romans and the Carthaginians made vague promises that if the other one was in trouble, they would definitely help against Pyrrhus. In the event, very little actual help seems to have happened. It's possible the Carthaginians may have supplied some ships, but that's about it. They don't actually end up fighting together, but they are notionally on the same side of this conflict. And in both cases, Pyrrhus wins impressive victories, but is unable to overcome the resources of either state, and then, limps off back to Greece. So these are two states. They know about each other. They have treaties setting out spheres of influence. They're great powers that are not necessarily implacably hostile to each other at this early point, which is, I think, worth noting that this is not a war that was sort of foreordained or inevitable. And indeed, as we'll see, it's a war that wasn't even really intended, certainly not at the scale it took.
Mhm. Okay, so when we're looking at the various sources that we have available talking about the First Punic War, um, obviously there's not that many of them, but how reliable or possibly how biased are these sources that we have to go on?
Yeah. So our key source for the First Punic War is Polybius. I have my Polybius next to me. You should always have your Polybius next to you. Is Polybius. Polybius is a Greek historian. He is writing a little more than a century after the conclusion of the war, so he is quite distant. Um, he is using two sources that he relies on that he has that we don't. The first is Fabius Pictor, and the second is Philinus. Fabius Pictor, Quintus Fabius Pictor, is the first Roman we know of to have written history. He did so in Greek, because that was the language of the genre at the time. Um, and Fabius lived through the First Punic War. He was born, we think, 270-ish. So he almost certainly served in the First Punic War. By 218, he's in the Roman Senate. So this is a high-placed Roman politician, although not a very successful one. He was never consul. As you might imagine, given that description, Fabius is, as far as we can tell, relentlessly pro-Roman in his narrative, and often at pains to disguise evidence that the Romans may have perhaps broken treaties with Carthage or acted unscrupulously with Carthage. Polybius is more gullible on these points than he should be. He trusts Fabius when he shouldn't. On the other hand, Polybius's other source is Philinus. Philinus is a Sicilian Greek from Agrigentum, and he seems to have been very pro-Carthaginian. Both Fabius and Philinus's accounts are lost. Polybius uses both and compares both. And we also know that Diodorus Siculus, who writes even later than Polybius, he is heavily reliant on Philinus. And so the bits of that we have that stronger pro-Carthaginian slant. Philinus is also, I should note, a contemporary of the war. So Polybius has two contemporaries that he's working from. Polybius also has access to the Roman archives. He has access to official records for Rome, but not for Carthage. And so his account of the war is very much a Roman's eye view of the conflict. Now, for Polybius himself, we also need to be worried about not just his sources, but also about him. Polybius is making a point in his narrative. This is an argument, and that should put us on guard. The First Punic War occupies book one of Polybius's histories, and that's not an accident. He's starting here for a reason. Polybius's histories overall are building out an argument he's very explicit about, which is that the domination of the Mediterranean by Rome, which by Polybius's day is seeming very inevitable. He's arguing that domination is not by chance. Rome's victory is not by chance. And that instead Rome had structural advantages that meant that its victory was inevitable, was always going to happen. And in part, Polybius is writing for a Greek audience, in particular, a Greek audience that in the 140s has rebelled against Rome and been smashed flat. And he's trying to convince them, don't do that. You're not going to win. Stop trying. This isn't going to work, not unless you adopt a lot of Roman practices, which maybe you should also do. So on the one hand, we generally think that Polybius is pretty reliable. He's usually a fairly shrewd source. Polybius doesn't lie. On the other hand, Polybius fudges. He will conveniently not tell you things that's valuable for his argument. He will arrange things in ways that are useful for the argument he's making. And crucially here, Polybius wants to stress, one, the Romans are terribly adaptable and effective, and you shouldn't fight them. And two, this naval war was the biggest ever naval war ever. Which, I mean, arguably is still the largest naval war fought in the Mediterranean. So he's on to something there. But he's going to take every opportunity to make it seem very big. Though, again, I would contend Polybius doesn't generally lie.
Okay, so that's a background of where the information we have is coming from. So with that in mind, when the First Punic War kicks off, what is ostensibly the trigger for the war, and how do we think people were expecting the war to go when it does break out? Kind of ranking up fleets and how many ships has everyone got at that point.
Right. So I think the first key thing here is that Dexter Hoyos has made this argument, and I think convincingly, nobody thought they were getting into a major war when this started. Um, and so this is one of those instances where a very small conflict that everyone expects to remain very regional and contained flares up into a major war through both sides escalating in a way that no one seems to have expected. So the war starts with this minor flare-up over Messana, modern-day Messina on Sicily. Um, the all the fighting on Sicily with Pyrrhus and so on in the 280s, 290s, 280s, 270s. Syracuse had hired a whole bunch of mercenaries from Italy. Um, when the tyrant of Syracuse, Agathocles, had died in 289, I think. I don't know. The comments will tell me that I'm wrong, I'm sure. Um, when he dies, that leaves all of his mercenaries unemployed. Syracuse is the largest city on Sicily. It's a very large Greek city-state, one of the largest, a peer of Athens and Sparta in terms of its power. It has been dueling Carthage on and off over for the island for 200 years at this point. Um, and so these guys were hired by Syracuse. Syracuse is horrifically politically unstable. And so, when their leader dies, these guys are without a job. And so they decide to basically sack and seize control of this small strategic town of Messana and turn it into, frankly, a pirate base. Um, and they call themselves the Mamertines, the Sons of Mammers, which is the one of the Italian names for Mars. So they're like, we're the Sons of Mars, right? Very bad, I suppose. Um, Syracuse gets its act together. It gets a new tyrant running the show, Hiero II, in 270, and he's like, we need to clean up these nonsense guys over here. And so Syracuse begins pressuring the Mamertines, laying siege, and generally the Mamertines are not in a position to fight Syracuse. Syracuse is big and powerful. Um, so the Mamertines initially appeal to Syracuse's traditional enemy, which is Carthage. And the Carthaginians promptly send a fleet. And the fleet shows up and it occupies the harbor. And the Mamertines begin to realize they may have made a mistake, because Carthage is also big and powerful, and the Carthaginians are here to score one against the Syracusans, not to do the Mamertines any favors. And so the Mamertines now they call to Rome for help, to help them against the people they called to help them, to help them against their former employers. The Mamertines are great fellows. And I think Rome shows up. Polybius gives a very moralizing version of this narrative, but I think we can also see the strategic impetus here that Rome is fine with Messana being independent, but doesn't want any power to dominate it because it's the door to Italy. And so Rome is going to intervene to control that space. And so the Romans send an army and a very small fleet. We'll talk about fleet sizes in a second, to intervene, but sort of very quickly, the Romans, the Syracusans, and the Carthaginians all collectively think that this is a minor thing about one town. It's going to turn into a huge war over the entirety of Sicily. They don't expect that. Syracuse is the first state to just be obviously out of their depth. The Romans show up. Syracuse initially, one, realizes that being an independent power in a three-way war is not going to work for them. They throw in with Carthage, get their army banged up a bit, and then promptly peace out of the war in 263, just 1 year in. So Syracuse realizes that they have badly miscalculated in the first year of the war. That they're looking at two powers that can add a zero to their army numbers comfortably, and they're like, oh. Uh, um, so they bail out of the war pretty hard. In terms of naval resources, Rome and Carthage are in very different positions at the start of the fight. It's very convenient for Rome that the Strait of Messana is about 3.5, 4 miles wide, and you can get across it in a rowboat, which they do. So Carthage maintains a standing navy in this period. It's hard to track exactly how large it is, but generally it seems like they probably keep around 200 ships in existence, though they only man a small number of those in any given year unless there's a crisis. It's pretty clear when there is a big war, the Carthaginian fleet tends to be about 200 ships. That's chunky. That is one of the largest navies in the Mediterranean, larger than what Athens is employing when it fights with Sparta, for instance, larger or at least a peer of the navies of Alexander's successors. So that is a big, powerful navy. Um, but again, 200 ships, but in any given year, most of them are in mothballs for reasons we'll get into. Um, Rome, by contrast, is primarily a land-based power. Polybius likes to claim the Romans don't have any ships. That's stretching the point. Rome has two sources of ships potentially at the start of the war. The one source we know they have is that some of the communities in Italy, so when Rome beats you, if you're a community in Italy, they work by what I tell my students is the Goku model of imperialism. I beat you, therefore we are friends. Um, and so usually when Rome defeats you in Italy, you get made a socius, an ally of Rome, which means subject.
Mhm.
And you have to send troops to their armies. But for some of the more maritime communities in Italy, Rome makes them the socii navales, the naval allies. And so they have to supply ships and crews rather than troops. Um, and when Rome has to cross the strait, this is how they put together their sort of scratch fleet to do it. Polybius's description of this fleet is really modest. Most of the ships are very light. They're not big, heavy warships. There are about 50 of them. Um, I suspect Polybius is, because of the point he's making, is somewhat underestimating the scale of this fleet, making them seem a little bit more ragtag than they are. The other thing we know about Rome is that we know in the late 300s and in the early 200s, we see these officials that the Romans have, the duum viri navales, the two men for ships. The Romans are terribly descriptive in naming officials. I love it. Who maintain a naval squadron of maybe 20 or 30 ships. That naval squadron is actually important in how Rome's war with Pyrrhus breaks out. So we know it existed before. Polybius doesn't mention it. Our other sources in this period don't mention it. It's not clear if it exists at this point, but it seems really likely that it does. And so presumably, Polybius says the Romans have 50 ships at the start of this war. And so that's presumably a mix of whatever they can get the allies to give them, whatever's left of this squadron that they seem to have had. But obviously, it's not going to challenge Carthage. And it's really clear from Roman maneuvering in the first year of the war, where the question is, how do we get across this strait? That they are not capable of fighting the Carthaginian fleet. They have to basically sneak across at night and then attack the city from land, taking advantage of the fact that the strait is very narrow and that the Carthaginian admiral is not the most vigilant of fellows.
Fair enough. So, going a bit more into detail on the ships, what were the differences, if there are any, between the types of warships that the two sides are using?
Yeah, so this seems to mostly be a mirror match. Both fleets are operating within the sort of Mediterranean shipbuilding tradition. I think people often think of it as the Greek shipbuilding tradition, but
Hmm.
obviously the Carthaginians are Phoenician. They're not Greek, but this Mediterranean shipbuilding tradition um, that they're mostly using the same ships. Um, and this is the standard oared Mediterranean warships, ramming-based warships that you're familiar with, right? You have your biremes, triremes, and then we go up. We have quadriremes and quinquiremes and hexaremes and septiremes and so on. We're adding rowers as we
Mhm.
go up those numbers. In terms of within that system, what ships they're using, one thing that's really striking is that in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the successors of Alexander are fighting, they are quickly building really enormous versions of these kinds of warships. We hear about right. So the trireme is like it's a trirace, it's a three, because if you slice it vertically, you have three stacked rowers for each side. It's a crew of about 200 total. And then you have like a bireme is smaller. It's a two. Almost no one uses these in fighting by this point. Like it's a rowboat.
Mhm.
But then you have fours, the quadrireme, or in Greek, the tetrares. I'm mostly going to use the Roman
Mhm.
Latin terms for these ships, just for the sake of simplicity. Then the quinquireme is a 5. You're not stacking rowers up. As a side note, you're widening the ship. All of these are going to have 2 or 3 vertical stacks because if you go any higher, the ship just falls over.
Mhm.
Um, and the Romans and the Carthaginians don't really go beyond a 5. Occasionally, they'll have a 6 or a 7 as a flagship, and that's it. They're like bigger ships aren't useful. In the Eastern Mediterranean, you have 6, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 12s, 14s, 16s, some 20s. The Ptolemies build a 40. Um, for reasons, it's not clear that that ship can even get out of the Nile Delta. But the Romans and the Carthaginians are, I think, a lot more clear-eyed about this, that they sort of want a standard form battleship, and that is the 5, the quinquireme. Now, Polybius implies that the fleets of this era are mostly quinquiremes. Um, Now, I say we have, the folks at RPM Nautical, who are not me, um, have actually managed to find one of the battle sites from this battle, from this war. The last battle, in fact, the Battle of the Agates Island, fought in March of 241. On March 10th, we can be terribly precise with this one,
Mhm.
because the Romans like dating their big victories. Um, and they found it and they've recovered a number of rams. Every time I talk about it, the number of rams goes up. We're in the mid 20s last I checked. Um, and I'm sure someone in the comments will know exactly how many we have today, and then they'll be
Mhm.
out of date by next summer. Um, One of the things that these rams have been interesting is that they seem to be, and I do want to stress this is a very technical subject and there are a lot of question marks and arguments, but they seem to be the rams of triremes. The bigger your ship gets, the bigger your ram gets, usually. Um, and so what the recoveries have begun to suggest to us is that maybe that Polybius's implication, and he never says it explicitly, he never sits down and is like, they have this many of it. He does this once at the very beginning of the war, and he's like, the fleet was mostly quinquiremes, and then lets you assume that that's true about every other fleet. What it seems like probably what's actually happening is that there are a lot of lighter ships in these fleets. That maybe the core are the big heavy quinquiremes. That the way you would deploy these is they would probably go in the center of the battle line, your line abreast to get all your rams facing the enemy, and then you get your lighter ships out to the edges where they have more space to maneuver. But there are clearly probably more triremes than Polybius lets on. But broadly speaking, in terms of the designs of these ships and the way they're employed, there's relatively little difference that we can tell between the Romans and the Carthaginians. It's largely a mirror match. Indeed, one of the really interesting things about the ram finds in the Agates Islands, based on where they are and how many they are, we can be pretty sure these are almost all or all Carthaginian ships that we're finding. Um, but a lot of the rams have Latin inscriptions. And what's happened here, when the ship is built, the ram is the most expensive ship component, so it has to be checked off by a treasury official. This is true, interestingly, in both Rome and Carthage, though obviously they have different treasury officials, because it's a huge hunk of bronze, and like the Romans mint their money in bronze in this period, so it's like it's a giant hunk of money that you're affixing to the front of the ship. So it needs to be checked off by a treasury official, that it meets specifications. And in Rome, these are the quaestors. We can date some of these quaestors because they later achieve higher offices, so we have a basic idea of how old they are, and they all seem to be pre-249, which is really interesting. In 249, the Romans lost a major naval battle at Drachma against the Carthaginians, and so what seems to have happened is that the Carthaginian fleet of 242 into 241 is substantially composed of Roman ships captured in 249 and are still in service in 242, 241, or at least their rams are, probably refitted and maintained. These ships presumably have been like up on blocks, because you actually do take these ships out of the water for storage. They've been up on blocks for 5, 6 years, and have been repurposed for this. So, I mean, when we say that they're using the same ships, we sometimes mean that literally.
Yeah.
They're passing the ships between themselves.
Someone who's been in several battles, like, hey, I recognize that ship.
Oh,
Give it
yeah.
back.
Yeah, right. and, and presumably they do.
Yeah. Um, so going even further into the warship side of things, there is, of course, the story that you hear in a lot of textbooks and documentaries and stuff. This whole thing about Rome building its entire fleet based off of some poor Carthaginian warship that washes up on its shores. And like, oh, we don't know how to build warships, but we can copy this one. How likely is it that that's actually in any way, shape, or form true?
So Polybius thought this story was so nice he told it twice. And so he has two instances in his narrative of the war where he says that the Romans build a fleet on a copy of a Carthaginian warship. The first one, the famous one, is that a ship supposedly ran aground trying to prevent the Roman crossing of the Straits in 264. That's Polybius 1.20 for those following along your Polybius. Um, and then when the Romans build their fleet, Polybius says they copy this ship to do it. Scholars have some doubts here. For one, as noted, the Romans were not quite so shipless at the start of this war as Polybius would like you to believe. Um, Two, Polybius is insisting that these heavy warships, these quinquiremes, were just totally unknown to the Romans. But these heavy ship classes are some of them are native to Sicily. I mean, the quadrireme emerges in Sicily. These are emerging in the waters around Rome, and Rome controls a number of Greek-speaking communities in southern Italy. This a sort of broad area of Greek settlement we call Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. So it's not like the Romans aren't plugged into the Greek-speaking naval world. They've just conquered Tarentum, which is a meaningful maritime Greek state, and it's not the only one that they have in Italy. So it seems unlikely. It's not entirely impossible. It seems unlikely that these ships would be entirely unknown to the Romans, or that the Romans would lack for shipwrights to build them because, well, they have all these Greek cities that build navies like this under their control. Um, on the flip side, right, Polybius represents the Carthaginians as being old hands at naval warfare, and they certainly are old hands at naval warfare, but the quinquireme is actually also probably pretty new to the Carthaginians. And so, this is a ship design that they seem to have picked up only relatively recently. This is an argument Krista Steinby makes. And so, I mean, it's possible that the Romans copied some element of Carthaginian design, but we should be on our guard about this story for sure. It fits with Polybius's larger narrative about how the Romans are very adaptable and they grab whatever military technology works. Polybius loves stories that builds to that point. And so I can absolutely imagine that like Fabius Pictor tells this story because the Romans like saying this about themselves too. But we might be skeptical as to how much the Romans are reliant on this, and especially skeptical because then Polybius does it again. And so much later in the war, the Romans are blockading the Carthaginian port at Lilybaeum. This is sort of the Carthaginian strategy is kind of anchored by these fortified ports that they resupply by sea that are their bases of operations. Lilybaeum is one of the key ones. And the Romans have this trouble because there is this fellow, Hannibal the Rhodian. The Rhodian is clearly a nickname. He's a Carthaginian, not from Rhodes. But Polybius is clearly distinguishing him from, Hannibal Barca that's going to show up later. Has not even been born yet. But Hannibal the Rhodian, who has this apparently very fast quinquireme, it's a very fine ship, and he keeps running the blockade. He keeps using his ship so fast to run the blockade. So when the Romans eventually manage to force his ship aground and catch him, Polybius says they first repurpose his ship into an anti-blockade runner because it's so fast.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the Romans build a new fleet several years after this, we're told that they build the entire fleet on this model. And once again, these are the sort of just so stories that our ancient sources love that we should probably be pretty cautious about. I think it's more likely that what we're seeing is a lot of evolution in ship design through this war that both sides are probably involved in. And remember, they're constantly capturing each other's ships. So they're going to be very aware of design innovations that the other is making. So the answer, I guess, is like it's a neat just so story. How much stock should we put in it? Probably not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've read about that particular story was I thought a rather elegant point, which was even if we assume that the Romans didn't have any warships before this point, they get this theoretically pick up this Carthaginian warship, and then they're magically able to build hundreds and hundreds of
Right.
copies really
Right.
quickly. And it's like,
Almost
well, if
immediately.
you don't have any shipbuilding industry, who's building all these warships for you?
Right. Right. No, and I think it's almost certain that the Romans are reliant heavily on Greek expertise from the Greek communities in southern Italy. One of the oddities, um, we don't have many of the ranks that you would see in the Roman navy as such. I should note the Romans in this period, to say they have a navy is deceptive, right? There's no institutionally independent navy. The Roman navy is when the Roman army gets on boats. And it's still led, like the consuls lead the Roman army on land and the consuls lead Roman fleets. When we get into the empire, there is an institutionally independent Roman navy, a series of naval squadrons. I mean, it's still basically the Roman army on boats, but it is distinct. And one of the things that's really interesting is that in inscriptions and in our sources, we see the names for officers and the sort of it's often called the hyperesia, like the trained specialist crew, like the helmsman and so on. And what's striking is that unlike every other part of the Roman army, these guys' ranks are in Greek.
Yes.
And that almost certainly, you can't necessarily be entirely certain, but it seems extremely likely that this reaches back into the Republic. And it has to do with the fact that the Romans are building their navy with Greek expertise and probably, at least initially, with Greek specialists, with Greek helmsmen and carpenters and so on aboard ship when they need that specialist. So, of course, the names for all these positions are in Greek. And so I think Rome is almost certainly leaning on the shipbuilding industry of the Greek speaking parts of their sort of Italian mini empire to churn out hundreds of these ships. Um, and that is something worth noting about these ships. If you put your mind to it, you can build a lot of these very, very fast. They are not like ships of the line where you have to sit around for a decade waiting for the wood to season before you can get started. The Romans regularly decide to build a fleet at the beginning of winter and to launch the fleet in spring. And it'll be like they're launching 120 ships. These fleets can be built very fast. Obviously you need to have all of that, all of those shipwrights and all of that labor. And I think almost certainly they're pulling this from Greece
Yeah.
or from Magna Graecia, from Greek communities in Italy, I should say.
It almost what makes me wonder whether or not the Roman side of things is maybe pulling a verbal sleight of hand in that they're saying, well, the Romans don't have any ships. And it's like technically Rome itself may not have any ships. The fact that they control all these other allies who do have ships but technically aren't Rome, they're kind of maybe leaving to one side in the background.
Yes, Polybius does exactly this thing, actually, when he talks about those initial 50 ships. And he's like, well, the Romans didn't have any ships. They had to like beg, borrow, and steal from like these various people. And like if you think about it, like all those various people are subject communities in the Roman Republic. Like that's not begging, borrowing, and stealing. That's going to your ship guys and saying, what do you have available today?
Yeah.
And that's what they did. Again, Polybius is playing a little fast and loose because the nature of Rome's control of Italy is loose. These allies are self-governing, but they're not independent.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about the Roman warships, one of the main things that comes out of this particular conflict that most people have probably heard of, even if they're not particularly specialist, is the Corvus, this big beaked boarding plank that's supposedly stuck on the front of them. Overall, do we have significant evidence that the thing existed in the first place? And if it does, was it more of a blessing or a curse for the Romans?
Oh boy, the Corvus. So we should be really clear at the outset about what our evidence for the use of the Corvus is. In the run-up to the first major naval victory in 260, the Battle of Mylae, Polybius makes a big deal about the Corvus. It is this new innovation the Romans are putting on their ship, and it's because they're so bad at naval warfare that they're gonna use it. You can swing it around to any angle and drop it on the enemy ship, and now you have a boarding platform, and now it's like a land battle, and the Romans are good at land battles, which tells me that Polybius has never fought on board a ship. But this is what he's saying, and he describes it in some detail the measurements and its positioning on the ship and so on. He then tells us that it is responsible for winning the Battle of Mylae, that the Carthaginians are totally unprepared for it. My gosh, and isn't this a great example of Roman adaptability? And then he never mentions it ever again. It poof vanishes from our sources. Much later Roman art of warships does not seem to include it. When we get to Roman naval battles in the late Republic, they're using grappling hooks to board instead of this boarding bridge. So it is like there for this one battle and then vanishes in a puff of smoke. So that's our evidence is really tricky. Now, on the one hand, right, Polybius's sources are contemporaries, and he gives us measurements for the damn thing. So it seems to have existed. He's not inventing it. But on the other hand, it leads to a lot of head scratching as to what on earth is going on here. The traditional suggestion, and this was advanced by Hermann Wallinga, was that the Corvus was an early war stopgap, and that its great disadvantage was that it made the ships so top heavy that it made them unseaworthy. And his argument is that Roman fleets in particular just get the stuffing kicked out of them by storms in this war. Two Roman fleets are almost entirely lost, one in 255 and one in 249 in storms. And so his argument is that probably the Romans ditched the Corvus because their ships kept rolling over in the storms because it's too top heavy. I've seen some math, some sort of design math to suggest that the Corvus might not have this effect, but it's hard to say for certain. It's also not clear that it's necessary to have the Corvus for the Romans to get beat up so badly by storms. A lot of what's happening for the Romans' storm-based bad luck is geographic. Storms tend to strike Sicily from the south. It is the southern coast of Sicily that you need to be really worried about because of the way the prevailing winds and the highlands of Sicily protect the northern side of the island from the nastiest storms. So if you're going to sail down Sicily, you want to do it on the northern side. The problem is there aren't a lot of good harbors on the northern side of Sicily, so you really need a base on that western tip of the island to resupply as you're making the route. And your problem is that the good ports on the western tip of the island are Lilybaeum and Drachma, Carthage's naval bases. So if you're the Romans, you can't do that. So you need stopover ports on the southern side of the island, Agrigentum or Panormus, which the Romans relatively early in the war do control, which means your fleets are regularly transiting along the southern side of Sicily, where the storms are worse. And then this is combined with your standard Roman aggressiveness, that the Romans like to push the limits, which means their fleets tend to be in the water in the months they shouldn't be. Ancient warships are not all year ships. You want to get these things out of the water for the winter months, what the Romans refer to as mare clausum, the months when the sea is closed to warships. This has to do with the way that they're built for speed, which we can come back to later. The Romans seem to consistently press their luck. This has to do with the Roman political system. To get command of a Roman army, you have to be elected to their highest office, the consulship. That is a one-year office, and you don't hold it in multiple years consecutively. So when you get your consulship, you have 1 year to become the great hero of the war, after which you're just another senator. And so Roman commanders tend to be very aggressive. They tend to push their luck. And so it's not hard to imagine a Roman commander setting out a touch early in the year or coming home a touch late, trying to extend their area of operation as much as they can. And so they tend to get caught. And they get caught consistently on the southern coast of Sicily, which is where you'd expect. So the boarding bridge may or may not be responsible for that problem. It does seem to poof out of existence, though. Krista Steinbe has done some research on this and has suggested, and I think convincingly, that if you look at the ratio of ships captured to ships sunk as the war progresses, as the Romans get better at naval warfare, they do more ramming and less boarding. And by the end of the war, the Romans are doing a lot of ramming and some boarding. Sure, they don't stop, but like the Romans are as rammy as the Carthaginians are. And so it's not hard to see the boarding bridge as an early war stopgap that stops being necessary as the Romans get just a little bit more experience. And we hear no mention of it after Ecnomus in 256. So they seem to drop it midway through the war.
Okay. Well, speaking of ramming and boarding and so forth, what are the overall strategies that the two navies are employing in this conflict? Because obviously they're fighting over Sicily, so both sides need to be at sea to get there. And how were these strategies affected by the fact that warships didn't tend to last too long, even if you did haul them out of the water in winter?
Yeah, let's start as a big question. Let's start with the lifespan and cost, and then we can work our way to strategy.
Yeah.
Um, so we know from the evidence for the Athenian Navy, which is employing similar ships, that this is an earlier navy. This is the 5th and 4th century Athenian Navy, that they have a lifespan of about 20 years. There's no reason to think the Roman or Carthaginian experience is different. The problem here is that the Mediterranean, especially its surface, is full of all sorts of exciting marine wildlife that eat driftwood. Your big problem here is Pterodo nivalis, shipworm. Merchant ships can have like shingles of metal plating along their hull that keeps the shipworm out of your hull because the shipworm will eat holes in your hull, which is bad. I'm told holes in your hull is bad. And folks on this channel are probably familiar with the sort of copper sheeting that you get on Age of Sail warships, partially for this purpose. In the ancient world, they're generally using lead for this purpose, thin lead plates, because lead is a waste metal. It's easy to work. They get a lot of it. It's a byproduct of silver smelting. So you get lead even if you don't want it. I mean, they do mine it intentionally too, but even if you don't want lead, you have some. So it's cheap and they use it for this purpose on their merchant ships. The problem, of course, is lead is not light and it slows those ships down. For a ramming warship, speed is offense and speed is defense. You're aiming right when you engage an enemy ship, you are aiming for a side-on ram. Some of these ships maybe were designed for head-on-head ramming. We'll come to that later. But that means that one, the offensive power of your ship is the amount of energy you can deliver is based on how fast you can go. So the more speed you can get, the bigger punch you can deliver. On the flip side, if you're in the being rammed position, the faster and more maneuverable you are, the more likely you are to not be rammed. So speed is offense and speed is defense. As a result, these ships are built light and fast. That has all sorts of its design implications. It's why they're so unseaworthy, because you're trying to pack as many rowers in the smallest possible place. And so the lowest bank of oars there is like inches above the water line to get as much speed as you can. But it also means that protecting the hull against shipworms, unacceptable weight implications. So the hull is naked wood, which means the shipworms are going to eat it. You can use tar and pitch to seal up the holes to extend the ship's lifespan, and they do this, but the ship is going to be at its fastest the moment it's deployed, and then as the shipworms eat the hull, it gets slower and slower and slower and slower, and speed is life. So the Athenians decommission ships regularly at about 20 years, sometimes earlier. So these ships have short lifespans. That does mean, as a side note, if you have a navy, you are continuously building ships all the time to replace ships that are coming out of service, right? You need to be building 5% of the total size of your navy every year. That gets into the cost structure of these ships, which is also worth talking about. And we don't have cost data for the Romans. Polybius doesn't give us that. He just counts ships. But we do have cost data, again, for the Athenian Navy. And these are very similar ships. And so the cost structure should be comparable. Building a brand new ship in the Athenian Navy might cost you around 7,200 drachma. Silver coin about, yay. That's a lot of money. It's really expensive. It's about 5,000 for the hull, and then the remainder is for the rigging and ropes and all that fun stuff. By comparison, it costs around 6,000 drachma to pay the crew for a month. Because you have 200 rowers at a drachma a day plus the specialist crew. Thucydides gives us this figure. He says a talent a month to keep them in the water. You also have maintenance. For the Athenian Navy, maintenance is the job of the triarchs. This was a public office that you did not want to get, that Athens would select some of its richest citizens every year. And congratulations, you're a triarch. You're notionally in command of the warship, but your main job is to pay its running costs out of your own pocket as a form of taxes. The average attested cost of a triarchy in the Athenian inscriptional corpus is 4,436 drachmae per year. So if we imagine, let's say, a ship over a 10-year period, it costs 7,000 drachmae to build, 44,000 drachmae to maintain, and assuming it's crewed every year for 8 months out of the year, because you don't run these things in winter, 480,000 drachma to crew. So we're literally moving orders of magnitude. Maintaining the ship is a full order of magnitude more expensive than building it, and crewing it is a full order of magnitude more expensive than maintaining it. So ships pulled out of the water are cheap, ships in the water with crews are expensive. And the result is that you have the oddity in this war that fleets are expensive to keep but cheap to lose. A fleet that is lost can be replaced quickly and easily. Don't have to pay drowned rowers a wage.
That's
Um,
convenient.
yeah, no, I mean, and frankly, both sides in this war are ruthless enough that they're like, oh well, you tend to draw your rowers from the lower classes of society. You're like, we have lots of poor people. The wealthy in society, they serve as the Marines up on deck because they can afford arms and armor. The result is that like both the Romans and the Carthaginians are able to recover from naval disasters over and over again. And so no naval battle is going to be decisive in the way that like you have Trafalgar and now Napoleon's navy is just going to be numerically inferior for the next decade because there's just the ships can't be replaced. That's not the case. You can have huge lopsided one-sided victories and then everybody rebuilds and sets up for the next year. That makes it really hard to produce decisive results with these fleets. So you need them to operate on Sicily, though for different reasons. The Romans need them because to take any of these fortified Carthaginian ports, they have to complete the blockade. If they can get a land army there, but Carthage can reinforce and resupply by sea, you'll just be besieging it. And in some cases, literally, the Romans besiege some of these places for 4, 5, 6 continuous years, just sitting outside there. The Romans build some works, the Carthaginians build some works, the Romans build some siege equipment, the Carthaginians burn the siege equipment, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But if you can't block the harbor and stop reinforcements and resupply, you can be there forever. So Roman fleets can be decisive where they can complete blockades. Meanwhile, if you're Carthage, of course, you need the navy just to get your guys there. The Italian peninsula is 3.5 miles from Sicily at the narrowest. You can get across in a rowboat, and the Romans do. Carthage is 150 miles from Sicily over open water. In obedience to the winds, it's actually about 200 miles because you have to wing around the what are today the Egadi Islands, and then come down to get to where you're going. And that's a long enough transit that you could be intercepted. You need a fleet to keep that supply line open. So Carthage has to maintain a fleet in order to operate. But of course, the problem is that if you destroy the other guy's fleet, you've denied him the use of a fleet for a year. And then next year he might be back. So if you're the Carthaginians and you sink the Roman fleet, hooray, your ports are unblocked. But they could be back with a new fleet next year. And if you're the Romans and you destroy the Carthaginian fleet, you have 1 year to capitalize. And you could do that to complete a siege and then try and win. Or as in 256, 255, you could use that opening to try and deliver a Roman army to North Africa. And the Romans do try this. They make a huge amphibious expedition to North Africa. They win the naval battle and then somewhat uncharacteristically lose the land battles. Which it's odd. One of the major structural factors of this war is that Roman armies consistently win on land, which is why Carthage is operating from these fortified port towns because they can't really win in the open ground in Sicily very often. But in North Africa, the Romans flub it.
Right. So, well, there you go. Strategy and lifespans. You must admit, it is very interesting to me the fact that, as you said, in most naval warfare that people are familiar with, people try and avoid the big, open, massive, decisive Mahanian battle because if you lose, that's it.
You're done.
Your fleet's gone. Whereas in this period, it's like, well, we lost 200 ships. What a shame. Shipwrights.
Right, we'll build some more. And that remains a factor in Mediterranean galley warfare. I mean, all the way out into the 1500s, right? I mean, the Ottomans are absolutely crushed at Lepanto, and they have a fleet in the water the very next year.
Mm,
These battles have consequences, obviously. And Lepanto has consequences, Lord knows.
yeah.
Um, but recovery to some level can be swift. The problem, of course, is that all of this costs money. Um, and so while both sides can replace fleets and they can put fleets in the water, in some ways you're slowly draining the tank of resources. And we know that when the war ends, um, Rome is absolutely broke. When the war ends, the last Roman fleet that wins the Battle of the Agates Islands has to be privately financed because there is no money in the treasury. The Roman aristocracy essentially ponies up to sponsor warships. One
Mhm.
has to assume then that if the battle had been lost, a lot of Roman aristocrats would have been financially ruined. The Carthaginians, they field their fleet for the battle, and then when they lose, Polybius tells us the Carthaginian people want to continue the war. The will to fight is still there, but they make a pretty clear-eyed assessment. Can we build another fleet? No. No, we do not have, they're like, we don't have the men and we don't have the money to fight again quickly. And the Romans have our army under siege right now. And so we need to make peace if we're going to get that army back because it's the only army we have. And we don't have a spare. So at the end of the war, both sides are absolutely exhausted. It really comes down to this last battle. If the Battle of the Agates Island had gone the other way, it's not clear there would have been another Roman fleet. They both fight each other to absolute exhaustion. Polybius really wants us to think about exhaustion in terms of losing ships. And what I think I demonstrate for an article in Historia is that it's not so much about losing ships because the ships are actually cheap to lose so long as you're inhumane enough not to care about all the dead rowers, which both sides are. But they're just expensive to keep in operation. And I sort of calculate a kind of rough estimate of cost. Roman and Carthaginian costs are pretty close to each other. I There's so much estimation involved in getting this that I don't think the difference is statistically significant. But the costs are enormous. These fleets are massive. The numbers of rowers are huge. You know, they're more expensive to maintain than to build, but they're still not free to build. Even a trireme is 35 tons of lumber plus a 150 kilogram bronze ram.
Mhm.
That's an extraordinary expense, and you're building hundreds of them. The largest fleets of this war cap over 300 ships. There's a lot of scholarly argument as to whether we should trust those numbers, but I actually think we should. I think those numbers are probably right. Polybius totals up and says the Romans lose 800 ships in this war, and yeah, that actually checks out. So the cost is enormous. The Carthaginians and the Romans are spending themselves down into nothingness. Um, and even if you're not losing ships, remember you're continuously replacing them anyway. You're paying the crews anyway. They cost a fortune to maintain even when they're up on blocks in mothballs. So it's extraordinarily expensive war. And that shapes the strategy of both powers at points twice in the war. The Romans are like, naval warfare is too costly. We're going to trim down our navy to almost nothing and try and win through land operations. And they spend most of the 240s trying and failing to win the war through land operations in Sicily and getting nowhere. Carthage does not have that opportunity because their supply line is longer. And so, the Carthaginian candle burns down faster in part because of geography.
I'm
But
I'm I'm kind of highly amused by the idea of a privately funded war fleet. I don't know if you've seen the series Rome, the TV series.
yeah,
Yeah, you know the little announcer guy who does the Roman advertising and everything. I'm
true
just
Roman
imagining
bread for true Romans. I love it.
exactly. I'm just imagining like this is like this trireme brought to you by Marcus Gaius and Sons, bakers,
Right. Yeah,
true
yeah,
Roman
right.
warships for true Romans.
For true Romans, right? No, you can almost imagine. I mean, it's not that crazy. I mean, when you think about obviously, in like the 1700s, very early 1800s, like privateering warships. In the War of 1812, the subscription ships
Hmm.
ever so briefly in the U.S. Navy, before they all get blockaded by the Royal Navy.
Hmm.
Um, so it's not entirely insane, but it tells you how desperate things are. That is not the normal way that the Romans build fleets.
No.
And they're truly they're on their last dime. And both sides have nothing in the tank at the end.
Yeah. So I suppose that kind of brings us on to obviously Carthage loses the First Punic War. We've mentioned the financing elements of things, but are there any other significant causes behind the overall Carthaginian defeats of their navy? Because in theory, they are, as you said, they are the more experienced naval power, but they seem to gradually be losing to the Romans physically in battle as well as financially.
Yeah. So Carthaginian leadership in the First Punic War has come up for some criticism, some of which I think is fair and some of which I think is unfair. Um, I think the fair critique is that it really does seem like the average quality of Carthaginian generals is lower than the average quality of Roman generals, which is odd because the Roman generals are amateur politicians, whereas Carthaginian generals are long-term professionals. You stay a general. Um, Part of this is probably the incentive structure. If you're a Roman consul in charge of a fleet, you have 1 year to be famous. By contrast, Carthaginian generals tend to stay in command. And instead of being rewarded for success, they are brutally punished for failure. If you lose a battle as a Carthaginian general, do not go home. They tend to crucify losing generals. It's pretty brutal. Um, and that tends to produce some pretty cautious Carthaginian commanders, as you might imagine. And caution in naval warfare is often a liability. I mean, I think there's a reason that historically the most effective navies have prized aggression. The Royal Navy, very obviously, but also, I mean, the U.S. Navy in World War II is like almost comically aggressive. Like we have 3 aircraft carriers and a dinghy, and we're going to come at you at midway.
Yeah.
And that kind of initiative seeking, seizing aggression, I think the Carthaginians struggle with that in both the first and second Punic Wars, right? Hannibal is very aggressive, but other Carthaginian commanders less so. Um, on the flip side, Carthage's overall strategy is defensive, and it's not a crazy strategy. What Carthage had been able to do over the previous 200 odd years in terms of managing its operations on Sicily, where it's fighting mostly Syracuse. And keep in mind, this is mostly for Carthage an economic proposition. Sicily is useful in that it generates revenue and trade. So they don't necessarily want to overinvest. Um, and so what they've been able to do is that every so often, Syracuse, as I said, is politically unstable. Every so often, a charismatic tyrant emerges in Syracuse, a dictator. He's very effective. He puts all the other little Greek states on Sicily together into an alliance and goes after the Carthaginians. And what the Carthaginians would do usually is they would end up holding out with their navy and their fortified coastal bases. And pretty predictably, the tyrant would fall from power or his alliance would break up and Carthage would then have an opportunity. They'd go on the offensive, win some battles, and make a peace treaty that would be favorable to them, status quo before the war, and sort of reset the board and often push into Syracusan territory. And that cycle repeats several times. So this sort of let the enemy attack first, exhaust them on your bases, and then get back at the peace table what you lost on the battlefield. That strategy has worked for Carthage a lot. And it's clearly the strategy they fall back to when they have trouble beating Roman armies in the field. And they're thinking, we're just gonna stretch this out until the Romans are out of juice. And then, you know, maybe we'll push them a little bit, we'll get some peace negotiations, and we'll reset the war to where it was when we started. Um, and then we're still the major hegemonic naval power of the Western Mediterranean, so life is good. Um, and that seems to be the strategy that they're pursuing. It worked against Syracuse. I think we can see in a way that I don't think any Carthaginian military thinker in 264 could see that this is just not going to play against the Romans. That we know what happens in the Second Punic War. We know that you can slaughter huge 80,000 man Roman armies by the bushel, and they're not going to stop. That the Roman political system creates incentives for this kind of relentlessness, that the Roman military system can furnish almost limitless resources. And so Rome is just not going to back down. And so a defensive wear them out strategy is just not going to play. But those achievements are in the future.
Mm-hmm.
They're not known. And so you can't fault Carthage for looking at this and saying, well, we're going to go for the playbook that has worked on this same island for 2 centuries, that has been successful against enemies that kind of look like the Romans, that they can beat us on land, but we can beat them mostly at sea. And that's the strategy we're going to go to. So I think some older scholars, often quite older scholars, are often very dismissive of Carthaginian strategy, frankly, occasionally in racist terms. It's just sort of really uncomfortable. This is, I mean, in particular, J.H. Thiel complains about what he calls Punic quietism. I'm like, oh, that's a little uncomfortable. Right? These are your inactive, lazy, submissive, foreign Easterners, right? That's the problem. Thankfully, historians have moved a little bit since the 1950s. I don't think you can fault Carthage that way. So while on the battlefield, Carthaginian leadership is just clearly not as good in the long term. I mean, I think the overall strategy, it was probably never going to work, but it wasn't a crazy thing to try. In practice, Carthage is backed into a corner by geography. They're further away. They have to sail 200 miles to get to this island. The Romans can get there in a rowboat, and that imposes structural costs on Carthaginian military activity that make it really hard to win a big war over Sicily. And of course, it's worth keeping in mind the Carthaginians didn't intend to get into a big war over Sicily. Nobody did. This escalates beyond their expectations. So, I think there's space to criticize the Carthaginians, but I honestly am of the opinion that has been overdone in the scholarship. And Carthage wins some naval battles and they lose some naval battles. The Romans do tend to outbuild them.
Yeah. And is there anything you think that Carthage, given the nature of their city-state, obviously Rome has, as you said, most of Peninsula Italy under their control. Carthage is sort of a city-state on what is otherwise a relatively inhospitable coastline with lots of little bits and pieces elsewhere, mostly dependent for their income on trade and things. Is there anything that Carthage could have done significantly differently within the plausible constraints of their system that could have potentially altered the outcome of the war in their favor?
Yeah. So one thing when thinking about North Africa, just generally, it's dangerous to think about North Africa today, with 2,000 years of desertification. North Africa in the ancient world was actually a very productive agricultural region. The food that feeds Rome before Augustus takes Italy comes from North Africa, comes from the area around Carthage. So they have a lot of population to work with. I think where Carthage gets stuck is in the structure of the Carthaginian state. So you have Carthage itself. It's a big city. It's got a citizenry. That citizenry doesn't like to fight in its own wars. It likes to hire mercenaries. And it generates the cash to do that by dominating both trade, but also all of these Libyan and Phoenician communities around them that are on this very rich farmland. It imposes tribute on them. The tribute is then used to pay for the fleet and pay for the army. And the army has a small African citizen corps in it, but it is mostly hired guys from wherever. That structure just imposes real limits on Carthage. Carthage can't go to the mattress in this war because they need their army to sustain the extraction of tribute from communities that will break for the exits the moment it looks like Carthage is weak. And indeed, the immediate aftermath of this war for Carthage, which I know we're going to talk about in a second, but like that happens immediately after this war. And so that makes it hard for Carthage to quite go to the mat as hard as the Romans. I think we also probably want to be pretty obvious or honest here. In the 200s, right, the Mediterranean has essentially a system of 5 great power states. The 2 really big Eastern states, Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire is enormous. easily the largest of the bunch. The Ptolemies are the richest of the bunch. You have the Antigonids controlling the traditional Macedonian homeland. They're the runt of the litter. And then the Romans and the Carthaginians. Um, Rome and Carthage go 2 rounds in the third century, and then one more round in the second century. And Carthage gets closer to beating Rome both times than anybody. The Romans are to their last penny in both Punic Wars. By contrast, in the second century, Rome is going to run the deck in a series of unanswered victories against the Eastern Hellenistic powers. It is almost preposterous how easily the Romans just kind of flip these guys over. The Ptolemies don't even bother to fight, um, including the Romans like casually sweep the Seleucid navy off the sea. Um, and so, Carthage does a lot better than any of the other Mediterranean great powers. And I think there's some awareness to be that, like, if Carthage's strategy wasn't equal to answering Rome, well, like, nobody else's was either. That the Roman military machine here gives Rome a military potential, a military capacity that is really quite beyond what anybody else has. Um, you know, the Seleucid empires, like, I'm going to do land warfare here for a second, but forgive me. The Seleucid Empire sort of all-call field army is about 80,000 men with maybe another 40,000 men in garrisons. Ptolemaic army is similar in size. The Antigonid army is like 40,000 guys tops if we get everybody. The Romans at one point in 225 check to see how many men in Italy they have liable for conscription, and it is more than 700,000. Um, the Romans in 215, after having lost 3 major battles against Hannibal, have almost 250,000 men under arms, all at the same time. Um, and so on some level, I feel like we can pardon Carthage for not winning. Um, because they really are facing a juggernaut here, and they have the misfortune of being the first state to kind of hit the Roman buzzsaw. Um, but obviously the very otherwise very formidable empires, right? You don't want to look at Alexander's successors and say like these guys are weak. They're obviously not. They're ruling huge territories, but they also get bowled over by the Romans and far easier than the Carthaginians. That said, I think the Carthaginian system it's just not set up to produce military power in the way that the Roman system is, and so it can't produce as much. Although I will note, the Carthaginians get a lot closer. I encourage folks here to read. Michael Taylor has a book, Soldiers in Silver, which is an analysis of the effective army sizes of these great powers, and Carthage gets much closer to matching the Romans in numbers in the Second Punic War than any of the other powers will get. Um, you know, uh, if you somehow scooped Rome out of the Mediterranean, um, it's hard not to imagine Carthage becoming the Rome, the
Yeah,
great Western power
dominant.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, that ends up overmatching everybody else. It's clear that Rome and Carthage are closer to peers, and sort of what Polybius is trying to explain to the Greek world is like, you guys don't realize, but like the war for who would control the Mediterranean, it was fought over there by these guys we thought were backward powers that didn't matter. They were actually much bigger than we were.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I guess that kind of brings us on to our final question, which is what is the overall effect of the war, the First Punic War, on the two sides?
So for Rome, they gained Sicily. It's Rome's first overseas province. That's obviously an enormous jump for Rome. The Romans, interestingly, they decide to administer Sicily very differently than they've administered any of their other conquests. Sicily is, we say made a province, that's not really a thing yet, but or more correctly, it's a very nebulous idea. But Rome imposes tribute on Sicily. Sicily does not become allies of Rome like the communities in Italy. Rome is going to take money and, in particular, lots of grain to feed its armies out of Sicily. Um, Rome will take advantage of Carthaginian chaos to also omnom Corsica and Sardinia fairly shortly after. So Rome is now an overseas power. Um, for Carthage, the results are a lot more immediate. So they get their army back in the peace deal. They have to pay an indemnity to Rome. They're already basically broke. And so Carthage isn't able to pay their mercenary army and it revolts. And when it revolts, a great number of Carthage's subject communities revolt with it, leading to what's called the Mercenary War. Carthage has to spend the next several years defeating its own mercenary army and reconquering its northern African holdings, which it does. It's just pretty clear that there is tremendous resiliency in the Carthaginian system. Like, this should have been an empire-ending crisis, and it's not. Carthage tames its armies, beats its subjects back into submission. One of the major figures here that emerges is Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. This is where he makes his career. And then Carthage has to think about how to expand and rebuild without expanding into Rome. And the decision here that gets made is to expand more into Spain. And this is going to be led by the Barcids, by Hannibal's family. And it will eventually, decades later, in 218, lead Carthage into the Second Punic War with Rome. In the meantime, it seems to have changed the nature of Carthaginian power quite a bit. Carthage seems to neglect its navy in the years between and instead focus on land warfare in Spain. Hannibal's armies in Spain, or the Barcid armies in Spain generally, in as much as we can see them, have a small African core, often Numidian cavalry that is very effective, also from North Africa. This is an allied kingdom to Carthage. But then large numbers of infantry recruited from Spain and then later from Gaul, from southern France. So they're locally recruited armies. And Spain is going to provide Carthage the manpower reserves to do the Second Punic War. And while they eventually lose, as I note, they go more rounds with Rome than anybody else. So the nature of the Carthaginian Empire also seems to be changing in this period as a result of their defeat. Carthage does have some ships active in the Second Punic War, but they never make a serious effort to challenge the Roman navy again. They sort of recognize that's not the way. And instead, right, Hannibal's plan is land operations in Italy.
Okay. So that actually kind of almost completely changes the direction of one, but actually changes the direction of both empires.
Both
really,
empires.
Carthage is overseas and then turns into more of a land power, and Rome is a land power that starts to become more of an overseas. So almost swapping positions in a crude way, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, that's a pretty decent summary of the First Punic War and what happens, almost entirely central on who has the better navy and who can keep their navy afloat for more than 5 minutes.
Right.
So, thank you very much to Bret Deveraux for informing us of that, and hope that's all been very interesting for everyone listening. Certainly was for me. And we shall wrap up here, but who knows, we might come and revisit other elements of ancient naval campaigns at a future date. So
I hope so.
Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone, and see you later.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.